Welcome to the Lifestyle Evolution Podcast. My name is Joshua Laycock. I am your host. For those of you who don't know me, and it may be relevant for today's podcast, I am a men's coach. I've been working with men in a variety of capacities for close to a decade now, on my own and through other men's groups. And in the province of Ontario here in Canada, at the time of recording, I am a registered psychotherapist qualifying. The qualifying at the end means that I am operating under supervision, but I am a practicing psychotherapist here in the province of Ontario. And as I was thinking about what I'd like to speak about this week, I decided to go back to kind of the basics and why am I doing this podcast? And really what I want to do is share the things that I've learned over the years with the people who are listening, principally men. But in many ways, what I'm going to talk about today is going to be applicable to just about everybody. Things that I wish that more people knew, things that might be helpful along their journey. For most of the people who are listening in, you're either in the personal development phase, you're trying to grow, or you're in the healing phase. And there's things about your world and your life that are not operating as well as you would like and are likely holding you back. And as I sit in sessions with men, there are a lot of themes, a lot of common elements that pop up pretty routinely. So I put together a list of things, 5 things I think that men need to know about to heal and to grow. These are things that not enough people know about. And I also find that in my sessions, I typically start rattling through these, call them truths, things that people need to know that not enough people know. And it sort of lays the foundation for the work that we're going to do. But I find if these elements can really be assimilated and absorbed into who you are, on their own, they can actually make a significant amount of impact. So this is not a proxy for therapy. And in fact, some of the things here are going to be a case for therapy, if that's what you're working through. But depending on your circumstances, these things, if explored properly and taken to heart, I think on their own can stand up and help clear away some of the traffic, clear away some of the obstacles to growth and to healing. It's not an exhaustive list, and I'm sure everyone or many people will have exceptions to some of the things that I'm talking about, the yeah buts. And look, life always has exceptions, which is why, ironically, I try to use the term always and never very sparingly. Every now and then, I think it works. But yeah, most of the time, in almost all situations, almost all, these things are going to be true. And they're not always popular. And one of the things out of the gate that I think is worth noting to people who are on this journey is that, notwithstanding what I think some of the preliminary research might show or what some practitioners in the world think, I don't believe personally that true, profound healing, really getting to the root of what's going on, can be done in 4 or 5 quick sessions. Sometimes that's enough to kind of create a bit of momentum, but I don't believe the work is done. And the truth is, I don't think the work is ever really done. That's not to say that you need to be with a coach or therapist until the end of time. That would obviously be very self-serving and not true. But I don't ever believe there's a point at which we can be like, okay, cool, job done. I did my introspection, did my journaling, did my therapy sessions. I'm all good. I just don't really know anybody who's all good. And again, we're not hunting for problems. We're not necessarily trying to just beat the hell out of ourselves, nor do we need to be chasing this constant improvement all the time. But even if we get to a place where, you know what, I'm pretty happy, I'm pretty content, life is good, it's going to require some active maintenance strategies, and new things are going to pop up all the time. So settle in for a lifetime of work, of exploration, of compassion and curiosity, and recognize that there are going to be moments of improvement. There's going to be moments where we backslide. There's going to be moments where life is going to be humming along pretty nicely and we can let some of those things slide. But also there are going to be times where, we feel like we're struggling and we need to step it up. And sitting in with some of these things and reconnecting with some of the things that we're going to talk about today, I think will enable us to get moving again. Because a lot of these things that we're going to talk about, these 5 things that men need to know to heal and grow, they're not often understood. And in many cases, just people didn't really think about it, or they go contra to what the world seems to think is the right way to do it, particularly on social media. So let's dive in. The first thing that I wish that every man would know is that they need to abandon this notion that shame and guilt are motivators. Shame and guilt, they do serve a purpose in our lives. And yes, I think sort of evolutionarily, they represent a warning light, a deterrent from behavior that is contra to what the group, the tribe, even the human, the individual really ought to be doing. And if those markers of shame or guilt were doing their job, you'd probably be staying on the straight and narrow. You'd probably not be really worried about feeling shame or guilt, to be honest. I mean, yes, there are some religious organizations that have made the use of guilt an art. But again, I'm not convinced that if you've crossed over into this world where now you are feeling shame and you are feeling guilt, that the imposition of these feelings is going to do anything but harm you. So let's first identify what the difference is. And they're pretty profound. So guilt is like regret or remorse, or the feelings that we feel when we've done something wrong. When we've done a thing, and it makes us feel bad. It makes us feel, it lets us know that we've done something wrong. We make mistakes. Guilt is generally limited to an event, an action, or an inaction, depending on the circumstance. Shame is when those sort of feelings permeate your entire core. And now, instead of I've done something wrong, it evolves into I am something wrong. I am a bad person, as opposed to that was not a good thing to do. That was a bad thing to do. Now it's this personification. It's insidious. And yeah, like I said, I think at its core, these notions are designed to keep us on our path, right? One of the objectives that I often talk with my clients about is like in therapy, and this is not a unique idea. I've read this and borrowed this from others, as pretty much as everything that we do in this world. But really, the notion of therapy for a lot of people who are trying to get their lives back on track is like, let's just try to minimize the amount of things that we're going to do that we're going to feel guilty about or maybe have regret over. In other words, let's make better decisions going forward. And a lot of people walk into my office with deep feelings of shame or guilt. If this notion of I'd really like to not feel that, so I'm going to try to make really good conscious decisions, if that's where you're at, then yeah, you know what, the presence of guilt or shame can be helpful. Now, it may also be this overblown fear that stops you from doing the things that you want to do in life, that stops you from really stepping into who you are and exploring the experiences that you want to have. But one of the reasons why I know that this is not an effective tool is because a lot of people who walk into my office who have had things happen to them, pretty uncomfortable, pretty horrible things, also bring with them a sense of guilt or shame. But they've done nothing wrong. So then how can guilt or shame be an effective motivator if it shows up even in moments where it has no place being? And our ability to differentiate between, am I feeling guilty because I kind of did a little bit of a bad thing? Versus, am I feeling guilty even though I haven't really done anything wrong and something really bad has happened and I just have a hard time making sense of it? So absent better understanding or more awareness of what this really means, I'm going to have to internalize this. Therefore, it's my fault. Because it has to be, because who else is going to come and help me? And we'll talk about the responsibility that we have going forward. But the way that guilt and shame shows up right now, and the way that it's been deployed for a very long time as a tool of coercion and of manipulation, to me invalidates its relevance as a motivational tool. And here's the other thing, right? I know people and I've heard of people who have used shame and guilt to motivate people. Just like rage, that is an emotion that burns white hot, that can motivate in the short run. But again, it doesn't address the issues, and in fact, it often compounds the root issues. And I would say that people who have been able to overcome challenges in the short run through the use of shame and guilt often experience a Pyrrhic victory, right? We are destroyed in the process. It's not sustainable. It is deeply unkind to ourselves. And it is hardly the most effective tool to moving forward. But for some reason, particularly I think men, but that's what I can speak to, we find there's some nobility in imposing guilt or shame on ourselves. And I think in the world of extreme ownership, which is a remarkable book by someone I have a huge amount of respect for, and it is essentially the notion of whatever happened, it's my responsibility. And I agree with that. But somehow that got conflated, got messed up and intermingled with, therefore it's my fault. Therefore this was my fault. And as a result of it being my fault, I should feel guilty. And if I have enough things happen, then that's going to evolve or devolve into shame. I think that misses the mark. And honestly, I think it's too easy. I think it's almost lazy, right? Rather than taking responsibility and taking action, if we could just sit there and feel shitty about ourselves, well, then at the very least, I can feel a little bit better about myself because I'm not accepting exactly how I am in this moment. So feeling shame or guilt in the moment almost gives us a pass, right? It's a short-term way of almost ironically feeling a little bit better about ourselves. At the very least, I'm not happy with who I am, and that must mean something. Then I don't think that works. It is probably the single biggest barrier to progress with all of my clients is overwhelming sense of shame and guilt. And again, people don't, I don't think, consciously choose to feel shame or guilt, but for some reason it has permeated itself. It's permeated into society such that it's noble. So that's why in almost every single session that I work with people, coaching, therapeutically, anything, is that we address what kind of guilt and shame is sitting there inside of you and in the way, getting in between you and healing. So let's abandon this notion that shame and guilt are motivators. There are some very big internet personalities that have made a business of doing this, shaming people for how they look, shaming people for their behaviors. They're tortured souls from the looks of it. And I just don't think it works. Enough people can look at themselves in the mirror and feel a deep sense of shame. Somehow externalizing that and having people point and laugh and scream at you, all of a sudden that's going to make the difference? No. No, it's not going to work. So let's set that aside. There's no nobility in guilt and shame. Number 2, I think we need to recognize that everything is as it should be, given the relationships that you have and the experiences that you've had in your life. Everything is as it ought to be. Now, this is a statement that I use time and time and time again in my sessions with my clients, and it can be very, very easily misunderstood. So I'd like to break it down. And all of these items have threads, and they connect to one another. I believe very strongly that we are, in this exact moment, the byproduct of everything that has happened in our world. And biologically, in fact, we are impacted by things that happened even before we're born. Every crosswind, every gravity, every event, every happy event, every sad event, every trauma, every glorious victory, every relationship, every failed relationship, everything is a variable in the story of us. And I believe that we show up in this moment exactly how we ought to, given those variables. What does that not mean? That does not mean that this is your destiny. This does not mean that you are doomed if you are struggling. It doesn't mean that your fate has been written. These are the cards you were dealt. So, and I want to be really clear because it's easy to hear what I said and go, so there's nothing I can do, right? It's all already happened. What it also doesn't do is it doesn't excuse our behaviors. Past events, benign, exciting, traumatic, they don't excuse the behavior that we show up with today, particularly when our behaviors are self-destructive or impact other people. So while it is not an excuse, I believe that it is a reason. Dewey Freeman, you've heard me talk about him before, a therapist out of Colorado, has been doing this for a long time. He says, if I can get it right, there are no unusual or abnormal reactions. There are only normal reactions to abnormal situations. And that's a riff on what I'm talking about here is all those challenges in your relationship, all the issues that you might have with food, exercise, sex, relationships, self-worth, image, all of that stuff. It is a byproduct of the life that you have lived in its entirety. And that is why you show up in this moment. So again, why does this matter? This goes back to the previous point. The amount of shame and guilt that we are carrying in our lives, again, implies that this is my fault, this is all on me, and if I can just allow myself to feel shitty enough, maybe I can change. And while recognizing those feelings can be a catalyst for wanting to change and seeking help and choosing to now do the work, on its own, it's not enough. But again, why does this matter? Because if you feel like the world that you have created is merely a series of poor choices, and this is all on me all the time, then I think you're setting yourself up to fail because we're focusing on the negative. It's a very stoic principle of recognizing where I am today, the influence that all of those external factors have had on me, on my biology, on my psychology, and then taking them and saying, okay, these are the cards that I've been dealt. But if you play poker, yeah, the cards do matter. But I've seen people do remarkable things with shitty hands. Because you know what? Let's be real honest. Life is not fair and is not equitable. Never has been, never likely will. There are people who are born with pocket aces. And there's people that are going to be born with a 7-2 offsuit. And he's like, well, shit. Okay. But you're still in the game. And I know some people who have been dealt what look to be pretty awesome cards. And maybe they overplayed their hand. And life beat them. Wasn't as strong as they thought. And I know some people that have come in as total underdogs and played the game so beautifully that they've come out on top. So setting the poker analogy aside, right? As part of eliminating guilt and shame from our daily narrative, we do need to realize and to recognize that everything is as it should be. No value judgment on that. Just this is what should be happening, given the relationships that we have and the experiences that we've had growing up. Doesn't mean that we accept it as it is. Doesn't mean that we surrender to it. Doesn't mean that this is my destiny. But it is as it should be. And that ties into the third point I want to make, is that in nearly all cases, our quote unquote bad or undesirable behavior or thought processes, they are a physiological response to those circumstances. And it's not some character flaw. It's not some defect that makes you unworthy of love or self-respect. Those relationships, those experiences shape you and influence you. They influence your attachment type, how you show up in relationship, how safe you feel under what circumstances. And they ignite in you a response to certain circumstances, to certain scenarios that you're likely not aware of. Like, why do you show up in relationship in a certain way? Maybe you have an avoidant personality that shuts down when the relationship gets challenging. Maybe you have like an anxious attachment type that is constantly seeking validation and needing your self-worth to be tied to the happiness of others and to know, how is everyone else doing? And when they're okay, I'm okay. I'm really, really oversimplifying the in-depth field of attachment theory, but this is essentially what we're talking about is, well, why do we show up in those ways? Because of the way that we were raised, because of the interactions that we had with our parents, good, bad, or otherwise. Right? I've talked in the past about my mom and my stepfather's wonderful marriage that, from my perspective growing up, had an absence of conflict. Pretty awesome. Except that when conflict entered into my marriage, one, I saw it as a sign of inevitable failure, and I was utterly ill-equipped to navigate conflict in a relationship. There's no judgment on my mom and my stepfather for what they did. They did a phenomenal job, but it still influenced me. And when I was able to recognize that, no, I'm not someone who is just sort of destined to be scared, or I'm not someone who is destined to have a failed relationship, what I realized was, it makes sense that I don't know how to deal with conflict in a marriage because I've never learned. I've never seen it modeled. So now there's work to do to figure that out and to recognize why in those moments I was feeling the way I was feeling. That was exactly how I ought to show up given the circumstances and relationships that I'd experienced. You know, it's the same with when, the therapist question, right, is how does that make you feel? So what are the emotions that you're feeling right now, as we would talk through different stories? There's a lot of men who offer a very genuine, I don't know. It's not necessarily that they're avoiding the question. It's not necessarily that they don't want to tell me or that they're being quote unquote difficult clients. Maybe life has taught them that sharing how I feel is dangerous. It's going to lead to ridicule or abandonment, so I'm just going to hide that. And likely, if those were the environments in which you were raised, maybe you never even learned how to recognize what the emotions that you're feeling are telling you and what they really are. There's a lot of men that just never learn the language of emotion. And it is a language, it's a skill. Just like me knowing how to navigate conflict in a marriage is a skill that needs to be learned and flushed out and talked about, so are things like articulating emotion, recognizing that it's okay to have needs and to want to put yourself first sometimes, and how to articulate those needs, how to establish boundaries. Inversely, how to care for others, how to be aware of what my partner needs, how to read their emotion, how to have an intuitive sense of what my partner needs in the moment, how to have a healthy conversation, how to have small talk with a stranger, how to play with your children. These are all things that people come to me and say, like, I'm broken, I'm a defect because I don't know how to do these things. And if the mood is appropriate, I'll say, okay, fine. Let's finish our conversation in Portuguese. Well, I never learned how to speak Portuguese. Right. Neither did I. Do you feel bad about not being able to finish this conversation in Portuguese? No. So then don't feel bad about not knowing how to have a conversation in the language of emotion, or how to be intuitive and pick up on your partner's needs or how to navigate challenging situations. You just never learned how to do them. So given the circumstances, it is appropriate that you don't know how to do these things. And I get it. It's easier said than done to set that shame aside. Like, my wife and I are in the process of renovating our basement. And I don't know how to do that. I had moments of, what kind of a man doesn't know how to finish a basement? And then I would realize that that's a pretty unfair, a bit of an absurd statement, because everything is as it should be given the circumstances and relationships that I had. I was never taught, I never learned how to do those things. I never learned how to put up insulation and how to frame and how to do the electrical, how to drywall. I just never learned those things. So the shame and guilt that I felt for not knowing how to do these things didn't serve me, and it just didn't make sense given the life that I've lived. In many cases, the way that we show up and the way that our body responds to these types of events, it's actually your body doing exactly what it should do. And sometimes I'd be more worried if your body wasn't responding this way to various external events. But how do we deal with this? How do we move through that? So I'm here. Great. Life has blown me in all these different directions, and I'm here, and I find myself here. Cool. If I can deal with the shame, deal with the guilt, great. But now I'm here. What do I do about it? Four is be curious about your origin story. Know your origin story. If you are exactly where you should be or ought to be given the life circumstances, what does that represent? It represents all of the variables that influence your flight. It influences the impact of gravity. It impacts the wind, headwinds, tailwind, crosswinds. It influences drag. It influences your motivation. It influences your stamina and your resiliency. It influences all of these things. But we don't often understand them. So the first step in lessening the impact of those events is to better understand them and to understand how specifically they're influencing you and why. This is the let's do the work of going back and exploring your childhood. This is the work of what was your life like as you were growing up? Who was there to protect you? When did you feel safe? When did you feel scared? Did you have your needs met? Tell me about your parents. Tell me about your parents' relationship. Tell me about their parents and their relationship and the history of you. Because all of those things imprint and impact how you show up. A lot of guys come into session being like, I don't want to go backwards. That's backwards. I don't care. Yeah, my mom or dad were a dick, or yeah, this bad thing happened to me. I don't care. I just want to move forward. And I fully understand that sentiment. And looking backwards without then having a plan to go forward is a waste of your time. It is essential to understand your past, your origin story, through the lens, not always of judgment. I don't think, even if really horrible things happened to you, I don't know for the purposes of this exercise that judgment really adds any value. Trying our very best to look at those situations objectively and to understand the impact they've had. And yes, Some of those events are going to carry a lot of emotional charge, and we need to deal with those things, but really understanding, because we have this remarkable capacity of, quote unquote, getting used to things that have happened to us. And particularly as a young child, very young child, we don't really have, I think, the capacity to recognize that the things that are happening to us are bad in the moment. I don't know that. I mean, there are extremes, but I think if you're raised a certain way and you are conditioned to expect and accept that certain things are going to happen to you, then that becomes your new normal. It's not healthy, and it's a shame worthy of tears, but it becomes normal. The amount of people that I've spoken to who have described their childhoods, almost everyone is like, the average. And when we dig and when we probe and explore, some had really fantastic lives. Some had remarkable parents and blessings that few get to enjoy. Definitely not normal, whatever normal means. Definitely not average. And then there are people who tell me stories that break my heart. And I also say that's not average. It's not fair to you as a small child. So we need to understand the influence. And again, it's not about judgment. As I said, there are a lot of parents who gave it a really good go, who did their best, who were doing the best in the moment that they could based on their experiences and their relationships and the things thrown their way. But knowing why I'm afraid to connect, knowing why I'm afraid to ask for something, knowing why I'm afraid to speak up, voice my opinions, knowing why I'm afraid to ask for love or affection, knowing why I need everyone around me to be always good, knowing why I always seem to be the one who has to pull the family together, knowing all of these things, knowing where that comes from, allows you to see these beliefs, these emotions, and these behaviors through a different lens, through a different perspective, and lets you start to make sense of them so that you can unravel them and then have a game plan going forward. So we do need to be curious about our origin story. And this is where a good therapist or a guide will really do a good job of helping you, because sometimes this exploration can reveal pretty scarring, damaging, challenging things. Sometimes it's just very illuminating. You go, holy crap, that's why I do that. Huh. And you know what? That the knowledge of that story is going to pop up the next time that behavior seems to repeat itself, and it will give you this opportunity to go, oh, well, if I do this because of that thing that happened when I was 5, maybe I don't need to do that right now that I'm 35 or 45. Doesn't make it easy, but it starts to put some context around all those things and gives you an opportunity to rewrite your story. And that leads to number 5. If everything is as it should be, and nearly everything is a physiological response to those circumstances and those conditions and those relationships, it is very easy to throw your hands up and say, well, then, shit. I guess I'm done. I guess this is just me. And I understand where that sentiment comes from. It comes from a sense of overwhelm and exhaustion and fear and sadness. But that is not your story. Because even as you are sitting and listening to this podcast, you are adding to those experiences. You are adding to those relationships. and you are rewriting the story of you. You are creating a new path. So please don't for a moment think that that's your destiny. Because number 5 is you absolutely have significant influence over your future. The work that you do, the exploration, the tools and tactics that you learn along the way to interrupt unhealthy thoughts, to rewire your core beliefs, and to create a vision for yourself that pulls you forward rather than one that oppresses you, is part of that story. And every decision that you make, and every battle that you fight, and every moment of peace that you find adds to those circumstances, adds to those conditions. And yes, you can rewire your brain. You can retrain your body. A muscle, when it is not used, atrophies, but when you start to use it again, it builds strength rapidly. Things that kind of haunt you can change with commitment and consistency and a good guide to take you along the way. So while the guilt and shame that we like to throw on ourselves for the mistakes and the challenges that we've experienced in the past do not help us here, maybe choosing to live a life with as few regrets as possible going forward, and to really live consciously, and to do the dark, nasty, uncomfortable work to rewrite your story, to author the next chapter, regardless of what the last one says. That is on you. And that should give you power. That should give you hope. And tied to this last one, I guess, maybe a bonus item, is do not underestimate the essential nature of relationships and healthy connection. Monk mode is a big deal. People like to kind of go underground, go offline, hide from the world and do the work. Sure, but life happens in connection. Life happens in relationships. And I believe that the state of our relationships indicates our overall health and happiness. I really do. And if you don't believe me, how do you feel when you have an argument with your spouse? It's gutting, right? Not only do you have an issue that you now have to deal with, but the person that you usually turn to navigate those challenges is not right there to help you. That's why even the smallest little dispute with your spouse can absolutely derail us. But nothing feels better than when those relationships are humming and connecting. And it's not just with intimate relationships, but when you go through life cultivating happy, healthy relationships, not doing whatever other people need to make them happy, but to really be engaged, to really be able to express your needs, have those needs be met, to hear what other people need and help them meet their needs, and to create this beautiful sort of symbiotic relationship, this network of love and compassion and kindness, to know that you have a friend that you can speak honestly about, not just about the game or about the latest UFC fight, but to actually be able to share how you're feeling and to have someone sit with you and listen, and if appropriate, offer some advice. Those relationships just make most of life's problems pale in comparison to the joy that we can get from being in real deep connection with another human being or within a community. It's why healing rarely happens in isolation and almost always requires others to help facilitate it. And that's not to say that you need to hire a coach or to have a therapist to heal. Depending on what you're working through, I would strongly recommend finding a therapist who can help you through some of those challenging times, because it's no surprise that throughout all of our training, and the research backs it up, that the different techniques and tactics pale in comparison to the value of the therapeutic relationship. In other words, the connection that a therapist makes with the other human in the room with them is far and away the most important variable in determining how successful therapy is going to be. Connection and relationship. But for you, that may mean sitting down with your spouse and sharing how you feel and letting them know, and again, I've spoken about this a fair bit in the past, but when I was struggling and my wife and I were going through a tough time and I was in full withdrawal mode, it was us coming together and explaining, hey, she said to me, this is how I feel when you do this. And what was gutting to me was it was the complete polar opposite to why I thought I was doing it, right? She thought I was pulling away because I didn't care, and I thought I was pulling away to not torpedo something that was the most important thing to me. So the connection, the conversation, dare I say it, the vulnerability in those moments, the courage it took to have those kind of conversations, that is what brought us closer together. Not me sitting in a dark room stewing over why I do this. So that's why therapy and coaching is, while it is effective, some of the most potent work that we do is in group. It's why I've worked with so many different men's groups, because even just being in the presence of other men, recognizing that you are not the only one going through the struggles that you are going through, and that you can sort of stand shoulder to shoulder with other guys as you go through those challenging times, it is one of the most cathartic experiences that you can have. It's also why I started my own. The Lifestyle Evolution Project is an online group of men. It's small, and we are vetting who we let in, because the value that the men inside of that group are receiving in even a short period of time has been awesome. To see these guys light up, the conversations, what happens in there stays there. It's a sacred space. But generally speaking, some of the comments are like, I've never been able to open up to another man like this. I never realized that every single guy on this call is working through some version of what I'm working through. And why some of the guys on the call are saying that our time together once a week is now part of their non-negotiable. I think someone even said it's like going to church for them. It's transformative. And then to top it all off, financially, it's more accessible. So if you've never experienced a men's group, check it out. I mean, there's lots of them out there. There's a lot of good ones out there. I'm partial to mine. Like I said, it's small, it's intimate. It is very much a group coaching session rather than a big behemoth of an online men's group. And if the things here that we've talked about resonate with you, or if you've just never been in connection with another man beyond the surface level stuff that we talk about, sports, women, cars, then I would really strongly urge you to reach out. Find the Lifestyle Evolution Project. Shoot me a message. We'll have a quick call. See if you're fit for the group. Make sure that all the expectations are understood going in. And then how can we introduce you into that group? Because we have spots for about 5 guys left, I think, before we close it up for a while and let the men do the work. But almost all of the progress that I have made, the real meaningful progress, has happened when I'm in relationship with other people. Yes, there's been times where I do need to sit quietly and introspectively and explore parts of who I am. There's a time for that, for sure. But the leaps and bounds that I've made, the feeling of belonging, feeling alive, feeling connected, feeling purposeful, Those all happen in healthy connection, in healthy relationships with other humans. So to recap I guess now 5 and a bonus, 5 things that men need to know to grow and heal. 1, abandon the notion that shame and guilt are motivators. They're there, they serve a role, but they can't be your primary fuel. 2, recognize that everything is as it should be, given the relationships that you have and the experiences that you've had. 3, acknowledge that in nearly all cases, our quote-unquote bad or undesirable behavior, it's actually a physiological response to those circumstances and those relationships in our past. And it's not a character flaw. It is not an indication of how broken or hopeless you are. It is your body doing exactly what it should do, given the life it's lived. 4, be very curious about your origin story. Be open to exploring your past. You don't have to bring a huge amount of judgment if that makes you feel uncomfortable. You don't have to find blame or put this on someone else. Just understand where it comes from. Understand how your life, how the way that you were raised has influenced you. Understand how your parents were raised, influenced them, which then trickles down onto you. Be very curious about those things and willing to explore what that might mean to you. 5, recognize that you are now the author of your world going forward. There will be things that happen to you that are outside of your control, but you get to choose how you're going to show up. And with every step, every work, every podcast, every risk that you take to connect to a human, every conversation that you have is now rewriting this story. Every moment rewrites your story and adds to it. And you have absolute influence over how it ends in terms of how you show up. And then 6, as a bonus, please do not underestimate the essential nature of relationships and healthy connection. And if your current peer group isn't working for you, or if you're not sure how to have those connections and those conversations with your spouse, then find a well-run men's group. There's local groups, there's big behemoth online groups with online courses. There's small intimate groups like ours that are limited to a certain number of people. But find something and learn and experience what it feels like to have real, meaningful connection with men who have your back and who are more interested in things than sports, women, and cars. There is way more to life. There's a richness that it's a felt experience. I can't really explain it to you. There's a lot there. Listen to it a few times. Think it through, feel it through, but recognize that, yes, life has influenced who we are in this exact moment, but never for an instant surrender, cave in, give up. Never for an instant fold your cards, because there is always another hand to play. And you can always, in this game of life, draw on more cards to influence your life going forward. You've got this. I hope you have a great day.